The year was 1818, and England stood at the pinnacle of its imperial glory, basking in the golden aftermath of victory over Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars had ended 3 years prior, leaving the nation victorious, but forever changed by the experience of nearly 2 decades of continental warfare. Wellington's triumph at Waterloo still echoed in drawing rooms across the country, while the Congress of Vienna had reshaped the map of Europe according to British interests. Yet beneath this veneer of triumph, the social fabric of the nation was subtly shifting, as returning soldiers brought tales of foreign customs and radical ideas that challenged the rigid hierarchies upon which aristocratic society depended. In the grand drawing rooms of Mayfair and the sprawling estates of the countryside, the aristocracy had retreated into an even more elaborate world of ceremony and protocol, as if the rigid structures of society could somehow shield them from the chaos they had witnessed across the Channel. Thornwick Manor rose from the Hertfordshire countryside like a monument to Georgian grandeur, its imposing facade a testament to generations of accumulated wealth and political influence. The honey-colored Cotswold stone had weathered to a perfect golden patina that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, while elaborate Palladian columns supported a portico that could have graced a Roman temple. The mansion's perfectly symmetrical design spoke of mathematical precision and classical proportions, each window precisely placed to create visual harmony that pleased the eye and announced the owner's sophisticated taste to any approaching visitor. The estate stretched across perfectly manicured lawns that rolled like green velvet toward the horizon, punctuated by carefully placed groves of ancient oaks and exotic specimen trees imported from the farthest corners of the empire. Elaborate gardens cascaded in terraced splendor toward ancient oak woods that had sheltered Saxon kings and Norman conquerors, their gnarled branches bearing witness to 8 centuries of English history. A serpentine lake reflected the sky like a mirror, its surface disturbed only by the graceful passage of swans whose ancestors had graced these waters since the time of the first Elizabeth. The mansion had been the Ashworth family for 2 centuries, each generation adding wings, galleries, and follies that spoke of wealth accumulated through careful marriages, shrewd investments, and the occasional stroke of colonial fortune. Within these walls were crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk-covered walls. The rules of engagement were as complex as any military campaign. Every curtsy had its precise angle, every introduction its careful hierarchy. The Earl of Ashworth ruled his domain with the same meticulous attention he had once applied to his regiment, ensuring that his household ran with clockwork precision and that his position in society remained unassailable. Lady Margaret Ashworth had spent the better part of 3 months preparing for tonight's grand ball. The guest list read like Burke's peerage brought to life. Dukes and duchesses, marquises and their wives, counts and countesses, all carefully selected to maintain the delicate balance of social obligation and political advantage. The ballroom, with its mirrors imported from Venice and its marble floor polished to perfection, would host the finest waltz orchestra London could provide. The servants moved through their elaborate choreography with practiced ease. Footmen in pristine livery arranged hothouse flowers in towering displays, while housemaids ensured that every surface gleamed. In the kitchens below stairs, the French chef orchestrated a culinary symphony designed to impress even the most sophisticated palates. Nothing was left to chance in this world where reputation could be made or destroyed by the quality of one's champagne or the elegance of one's table settings. As the afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across Persian carpets, the first carriages began to arrive. Each arrival was announced with ceremony, the family crest on each door speaking volumes about lineage and influence. Ladies emerged in silk gowns that rustled like whispered secrets, their jewels catching the light as they ascended the marble steps. Gentlemen followed in perfectly tailored evening wear, their white gloves and polished boots testament to the attention they paid to every detail of their appearance. Lord Edmund Blackwell, the Earl of Ashworth himself, stood in the grand foyer to receive his guests. At 52, he possessed the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his silver hair immaculately styled, his evening clothes cut by the finest tailors of Savile Row. Beside him, Lady Margaret presented the picture of aristocratic grace, her emerald silk gown complementing the family emeralds that adorned her throat. Together, they embodied everything their guests expected from their hosts: wealth, breeding, and an unwavering commitment to the preservation of their world's elaborate social order. The guest chambers filled with the rustle of silk and the whispered conversations of ladies' maids attending to their mistresses' final preparations. Gentlemen gathered in the smoking room, discussing politics and business over fine brandy and Cuban cigars. The younger generation, those brave souls who had not yet learned to temper their enthusiasm with a proper dose of cynicism, could barely contain their excitement for the evening's festivities. Among the arrivals was Viscount Henry Morningdale, a man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure of any room he entered, as if the air itself recoiled from some invisible corruption that clung to his person. At 38, he possessed the kind of dark, brooding handsomeness that romantic novels celebrated. Sharp cheekbones that caught the light dramatically, eyes so dark they appeared nearly black in certain illumination, and a mouth that curved in expressions ranging from devastating charm to cruel mockery with equal facility. His reputation preceded him like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, pregnant with potential destruction. Whispers followed in his wake like a malevolent chorus, tales of gambling debts that had consumed entire family fortunes, scandalous affairs that had destroyed marriages and ended promising political careers, and business dealings that operated in the shadowy gray areas between legality and outright criminality. His romantic conquests read like a catalog of society's most prominent ladies, each liaison ending in circumstances that left reputations tarnished and hearts broken. Yet his title was ancient, stretching back to the Norman conquest, his estate vast and profitable, and his charm, when he chose to exercise it with focused intent, was absolutely devastating in its calculated effectiveness. The Viscount's evening attire was a masterpiece of Savile Row craftsmanship. Midnight blue superfine wool cut with mathematical precision to showcase his athletic frame, while his cravat was arranged in an intricate waterfall style that had taken his valet 40 minutes to perfect. Diamond studs winked from his shirt front like captured starlight, and his shoes gleamed with the kind of mirror finish that could only be achieved through hours of patient polishing. Every detail of his appearance spoke of wealth, taste, and the supreme confidence of a man who had never encountered a door that money or influence could not open. The Viscount moved through the social gathering with the predatory grace of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted, his progress through the assembled guests resembling a shark moving through a school of brilliantly colored fish. His evening clothes were impeccable, his manner assured, but those who knew him well could detect the slight tension around his eyes, the way his smile never quite reached them, and the calculating manner in which his gaze assessed each person he encountered. He carried himself like a man perpetually aware of his own secrets, while simultaneously hunting for the weaknesses of others. Lord Ashworth, the Viscount murmured as he approached his host, his voice carrying that peculiar combination of deference and subtle mockery that had become his trademark in social situations. What a magnificent evening you have arranged. The flowers alone must have cost more than most men earn in a year. Lord Ashworth's reply was measured, diplomatic, but edged with the wariness of a man who had learned to recognize potential threats in drawing-room conversation. You are too kind, Morningdale. Lady Margaret has devoted considerable attention to ensuring our guests' comfort. I trust your journey from London was pleasant. Indeed it was, though I confess I found myself contemplating the remarkable prosperity evident throughout your estates. Such well-maintained roads, such prosperous-looking tenants. One might almost wonder at the source of such consistent good fortune in these economically uncertain times. The words hung in the air between them, like a blade half drawn from its sheath, innocent enough on the surface, but carrying implications that made Lord Ashworth's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Other guests continued their conversations around them, unaware that they were witnessing the opening moves in what would prove to be a deadly game of social chess. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the manor's countless windows began to glow with warm yellow light. The orchestra tuned their instruments in the ballroom, their preliminary notes floating through corridors adorned with portraits of long-dead Ashworths. The stage was set for an evening that would be remembered not for its elegance or its entertainment, but for the scandal that would shake the very foundations of their carefully ordered world. Lady Rosalind Fairfax descended the grand staircase like a vision materialized from the most romantic verses of Byron or Shelley, her every movement a study in aristocratic grace refined through generations of careful breeding and expensive education. At 24, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that inspired both admiration and envy among her contemporaries. Golden hair arranged in elaborate Grecian curls that framed a face of classical perfection, sapphire eyes that seemed to hold depths of mystery and intelligence that few men bothered to recognize, and a figure that her ivory silk gown displayed to stunning advantage while maintaining the strict modesty required by social convention. Her dress was a masterpiece of current fashion, cut in the high-waisted empire style that emphasized her graceful carriage, while the flowing silk created an impression of classical statuary brought to life. Seed pearls embroidered across the bodice caught the candlelight like captured dewdrops, while Belgian lace at her throat and wrists added delicate feminine touches that softened the gown's dramatic lines. Her jewelry was deliberately understated, a simple strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, and sapphire eardrops that match her eyes and emphasize the aristocratic pallor that was considered the height of feminine beauty. As the daughter of the Duke of Pemberton, one of England's oldest and most influential noble families, she commanded respect through her lineage alone, but it was her intelligence and wit that made her truly formidable in the complex social chess game of the aristocracy. Her education had been supervised by the finest governesses money could procure, supplemented by instruction from masters of music, languages, and deportment who had previously served royal households. She spoke fluent French, Italian, and German, read Latin with facility, and could discuss philosophy, literature, and politics with a sophistication that many men found both impressive and slightly unsettling. Yet beneath her composed exterior and perfect breeding, Rosalind harbored secrets that would have shocked her admirers and provided sufficient scandal to destroy her family's carefully maintained reputation. Her correspondence with certain radical philosophers whose ideas about social equality and women's rights were considered dangerous by the established order had been conducted through carefully maintained networks of trusted intermediaries. Her clandestine meetings with advocates for social reform, including several who had been imprisoned for their political activities, were arranged with the secrecy and precision of a military campaign. Most scandalously of all, she had been secretly reading the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, whose Vindication of the Rights of Woman was considered so seditious that merely possessing a copy could result in social ostracism for a lady of her standing. Her growing disillusionment with the shallow pursuits that occupied most women of her class, the endless rounds of social calls, the obsession with fashion and gossip, the expectation that her highest aspiration should be to marry advantageously and produce heirs, was carefully hidden behind a facade of perfect propriety that had been drilled into her since childhood. She had learned early that in their world, a woman's thoughts were considered as dangerous as her beauty if they strayed too far from acceptable paths. Captain James Harrington cut a striking figure in his military dress uniform, the scarlet wool and gleaming brass buttons marking him as an officer of Her Majesty's forces. Having recently returned from service in India, where he had distinguished himself in several campaigns, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had faced real danger and emerged stronger for it. His dark hair and keen gray eyes, combined with the slight tan that spoke of years under foreign suns, made him an object of considerable interest among the unmarried ladies present. The captain's attraction to Lady Rosalind was immediate and profound, though he attempted to mask it behind the reserved courtesy expected of a gentleman. Their introduction in the receiving line lasted only moments, but the connection between them was palpable to anyone with eyes to see. When she offered her gloved hand, and he bowed over it with military precision, the air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, the Earl's younger sister and a widow of considerable means, observed these social dynamics with the sharp eye of a woman who had learned to read people's motivations as easily as others read books. At 35, she had transformed her grief over her husband's death into a fierce intelligence about human nature and an almost predatory ability to uncover secrets. Her black mourning attire, worn now more from habit than grief, gave her an elegant severity that made others confide in her almost against their will. Victoria had her own complicated history with Viscount Morningdale, a brief, passionate affair 3 years earlier that had ended badly when she discovered his simultaneous pursuit of a married duchess. The wounds had healed, but the knowledge remained, and she watched his every move with the intensity of a chess master planning several moves ahead. The Honorable Mr. Charles Whitmore represented new money attempting to buy its way into old society. His father had made a fortune in manufacturing during the war years, and Charles himself had parlayed those profits into railway investments that promised to transform England's economy. His title was recently purchased rather than inherited, a fact that the truly aristocratic guests were careful never to mention directly, but never quite forgot. His pursuit of acceptance made him both vulnerable and dangerous, as he possessed the resources to be either a valuable ally or a destructive enemy. Charles harbored a secret passion for Lady Rosalind that bordered on obsession. He had attended every social event where she might appear, had memorized her preferences in literature and music, and had convinced himself that his wealth could overcome the disadvantage of his inferior birth. His hatred for Viscount Morningdale stemmed not just from class resentment, but from the painful awareness that the Viscount possessed effortlessly what Charles might never achieve through any amount of money or effort. As the evening progressed, the guests moved through the elaborate social dance of a grand ball. In the ballroom, couples glided across the polished floor in precise formations, their movements dictated by generations of tradition. The older generation held court in the card rooms, where fortunes changed hands over games of whist and piquet, while younger guests gathered around the pianoforte, where Lady Rosalind's accomplished performance of a Mozart sonata drew appreciative murmurs. The dining room presented a spectacle worthy of Versailles. The massive mahogany table groaned under the weight of sterling silver and bone china, while crystal glasses caught and refracted the light of dozens of beeswax candles. Course followed course in elaborate procession. Turtle soup, turbot and lobster sauce, roasted fowl stuffed with truffles, and delicate pastries that looked more like works of art than food. Conversation flowed as freely as the wine, touching on politics, literature, and the eternal topic of who was marrying whom and for what reasons. Yet beneath the surface civility, tensions simmered like water approaching a boil. Viscount Morningdale's presence affected each of the other principals in different ways. Lady Rosalind found herself both attracted and repelled by his dangerous charm. Captain Harrington bristled at the man's obvious disregard for honor. Mrs. Ashworth watched for any sign that he might expose secrets better left buried, and Charles Whitmore burned with a resentment that grew stronger with each passing hour. As midnight approached and the last waltz was announced, fate seemed to draw these 5 individuals together like pieces on a board game approaching its climax. The Viscount, perhaps emboldened by wine or simply driven by his own reckless nature, made a series of moves that would prove fatal. His whispered proposition to Lady Rosalind during their dance left her pale with shock and anger. His cutting remarks to Charles about the difference between earned and inherited status drew dangerous fire to the younger man's eyes. His knowing smile to Mrs. Victoria suggested secrets that could destroy reputations. The final insult came when he cornered Captain Harrington near the French doors leading to the garden terrace. Whatever passed between them was brief, but clearly provocative, for the captain's face went white with rage before he turned on his heel and stalked away. Several guests noticed the exchange, though none could hear the words that had been spoken. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, the Viscount announced his intention to take some air in the garden. The roses were in full bloom, he declared, and the moonlight made them even more beautiful than daylight ever could. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when he stepped through the French doors onto the stone terrace, his figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the ballroom behind him. He would never return to complete another dance. The garden at Thornwick Manor was Lady Margaret's particular pride, a masterpiece of landscape design that combined English naturalism with classical formality. Ancient yew hedges created intimate spaces where lovers might steal private moments, while gravel paths meandered between beds of roses that perfumed the night air with their intoxicating fragrance. At the garden's heart stood a marble fountain depicting Diana the huntress, her bow drawn as water cascaded from her fingertips into a pool where goldfish darted like living jewels beneath lily pads. Moonlight transformed the garden into something magical, casting silver highlights on white roses while leaving red blooms mysteriously dark. Shadows pooled beneath spreading oak trees that had stood sentinel over the grounds for centuries, their massive trunks bearing witness to generations of Ashworth family secrets. Stone benches placed at carefully calculated intervals invited contemplation, while hidden alcoves offered privacy for conversations that could not be conducted under the scrutiny of the ballroom's watchful eyes. Lady Rosalind found herself drawn to this sanctuary after her disturbing encounter with the Viscount on the dance floor. His whispered words had been like poison in her ear, a proposition so crude and calculated that it had shaken her faith in her ability to read men's characters. She needed the clean night air to wash away the memory of his breath against her cheek and the way his eyes had undressed her even as they moved through the prescribed steps of the waltz. The evening air was warm for late September, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine along with the roses. Lady Rosalind's silk slippers made no sound on the gravel paths as she wandered deeper into the garden's embrace, seeking solitude to compose herself before returning to face the curious eyes of the other guests. Her white gloves gleamed in the moonlight as she paused to touch a climbing rose that had grown wild along an old stone wall, its thorns catching at her silk gown like grasping fingers. She was not alone in seeking refuge among the flowers. Captain Harrington had also felt the need to escape the suffocating atmosphere of forced civility that pervaded the ballroom. The Viscount's parting words to him had been a threat disguised as a jest, a reference to certain events in India that the captain had hoped were buried forever. The man seemed to collect secrets like other men collected stamps, and his willingness to use them as weapons made him more dangerous than any enemy the captain had faced in battle. The soldier's military training served him well even in civilian dress, for he moved through the garden with the silent efficiency of a scout on reconnaissance. His route took him along the outer perimeter, where high walls separated the Ashworth grounds from the surrounding countryside. Here, ancient trees created deep pools of shadow where a man might stand unobserved and study the house's lighted windows, counting the silhouettes of guests still dancing within. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth had also sought the garden's sanctuary, though her motives were more complex than simple escape. Her intimate knowledge of the house and grounds gave her advantages that the other guests lacked. She knew which paths were gravel and which were grass, which gates might be unlocked, and which servants might be bribed to look the other way. Her widow's black silk made her nearly invisible in the shadows, and her years of watching and waiting had taught her patience that few others possessed. She had seen the way the evening was progressing, had noted the tensions building like storm clouds on the horizon. The Viscount's reckless behavior suggested a man who believed himself untouchable, but Victoria knew better than most that even Viscounts could fall when they pushed too hard against forces stronger than themselves. Her position as the host's sister gave her certain responsibilities, but it also provided opportunities that a cleverer woman might exploit. Charles Whitmore's presence in the garden was driven by emotions more primitive than the other's calculated movements. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and frustrated desire had created a volatile mixture that threatened to explode at the slightest provocation. His nouveau riche background had not prepared him for the subtle cruelties of aristocratic society, and the Viscount's cutting remarks had found their mark with surgical precision. He moved through the garden like a man possessed, his evening clothes disheveled from his agitated state. The contrast between his father's money and his own lack of breeding had never been more apparent than in this moment of crisis, when years of careful social climbing threatened to crumble under the weight of his ungoverned emotions. The gravel crunched loudly under his feet as he paced the paths, his hands clenched in a fist that he longed to plant in the Viscount's aristocratic face. The garden that had seemed so peaceful in daylight now felt charged with possibility and danger. Each rustling leaf might hide a secret. Each shadow might conceal a plotting figure. The fountain's gentle splashing provided a soundtrack for clandestine meetings, while the maze of hedges offered countless opportunities for private conversations or covert surveillance. It was in this charged atmosphere that destinies began to converge. Lady Rosalind, seeking to avoid any further encounters with unwanted suitors, had made her way to the fountain at the garden's center. The marble Diana seemed to watch over her with stone eyes that had witnessed centuries of human folly, while the play of moonlight on moving water created patterns that hypnotized and soothed. Captain Harrington, following a path that skirted the rose garden's outer edge, caught sight of her solitary figure and felt his heart constrict with an emotion he had thought himself too disciplined to experience. She looked like a classical statue herself in the moonlight, her golden hair gleaming and her ivory gown flowing around her like sculpted marble. The urge to approach her, to offer his protection from whatever had driven her to seek solitude, warred with his ingrained respect for propriety. Their eyes met across the space of 30 yards, and in that moment, words became unnecessary. The understanding that passed between them spoke of shared values, mutual attraction, and the possibility of a connection that transcended the artificial barriers of their social world. Lady Rosalind's slight nod was both invitation and question, while the captain's bow conveyed both respect and determination. As they moved toward each other through the moonlit garden, neither noticed the darker figure that had been watching from the shadows of an ancient oak. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth observed their meeting with the calculating eyes of a woman who understood that information was power and that the right secret, deployed at the proper moment, could shift the balance of entire families' fortunes. The night air carried the distant sound of music from the ballroom, where the remaining guests continued their elaborate social dance, unaware that the real drama was unfolding among the roses and shadows of the garden. Time seemed suspended in this magical interlude, where the normal rules of society felt as insubstantial as morning mist, and where hearts might speak truths that daylight would never permit. But even in this enchanted space, danger lurked like a serpent among the flowers. The Viscount's entrance into the garden would shatter the illusion of safety and transform the peaceful sanctuary into something far more sinister. The stage was set for revelations that would change everything, and among the blooming roses, thorns waited to draw blood from unwary hands. The scream that shattered the night air was so pure in its terror that it seemed to freeze time itself. Lady Rosalind's voice, usually so controlled and melodious, rose to a pitch that sent birds exploding from their roosts in the ancient oaks and brought every conversation in the ballroom to an abrupt halt. The crystal glasses in guests' hands seemed to vibrate with the force of that sound, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the entire world held its breath. Captain Harrington reached her first, his military training overriding social convention as he sprinted across the gravel paths without regard for the noise his boots made on the stones. What he found in the rose garden's shadowed heart would be burned into his memory forever. Lady Rosalind standing frozen like a statue of horror, her white gloves pressed against her mouth, while at her feet lay the crumpled form of Viscount Henry Morningdale. The moonlight revealed details with pitiless clarity. The Viscount lay among the white roses, his dark evening clothes making him appear as a shadow fallen to earth. But it was the crimson stain spreading across his white shirt front that told the true story, a bloom of blood more vivid than any flower that grew in Lady Margaret's carefully tended beds. His eyes stared sightlessly at the star-scattered sky, and his mouth was frozen in an expression of surprised outrage, as if death had caught him in the middle of a protest. The murder weapon lay beside the body, a jeweled letter opener that Captain Harrington recognized from Lord Ashworth's study. The ornate handle, crafted of silver and set with emeralds that matched Lady Margaret's necklace, gleamed wickedly in the moonlight. Blood had pooled around the blade's tip, soaking into the rich earth where prize-winning roses drew their nourishment from soil that was now forever stained with violence. Within moments, the garden filled with shocked guests and concerned servants, their evening finery incongruous against the backdrop of sudden death. Lord Ashworth took command with the authority of a man accustomed to crisis, ordering the servants to secure the scene while sending footmen to summon the local magistrate and the county physician. Lady Margaret's face had gone white as her pearls, but she maintained her composure with the iron will that had made her family one of the most respected in the county. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth moved through the gathering crowd with the efficiency of a woman born to manage disasters. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. The way Charles Whitmore stood apart from the others, his face a mask of conflicted emotions that might have been shock or relief. The protective stance Captain Harrington had assumed beside the still trembling Lady Rosalind. The meaningful glances exchanged between certain guests who had their own reasons to wish the Viscount ill. The physician's examination was brief but thorough. Dr. Hammond, a man who had served the county's leading families for 30 years, pronounced death to have occurred within the past hour, caused by a single wound to the heart delivered with considerable force and precise aim. The killer had possessed either medical knowledge or exceptional luck, for the blade had found its target with surgical accuracy, piercing the Viscount's heart and causing almost instantaneous death. As the initial shock began to wear off, replaced by the grim realities of murder investigation, certain facts became impossible to ignore. Every person with access to the garden during the crucial hour had possessed both motive and opportunity to commit the crime. The Viscount's talent for making enemies had finally found its ultimate expression, and now those he had threatened and humiliated found themselves under scrutiny for his death. Lady Rosalind's discovery of the body naturally made her the first focus of investigation, but her genuine shock and the timing of her scream seemed to exonerate her from suspicion of the actual killing. Her explanation of seeking garden air after the Viscount's insulting proposition during their dance provided both motive for others to defend her honor and reason for her own presence at the scene. Captain Harrington's immediate arrival to assist her was noted by several witnesses, but questions remained about his whereabouts in the minutes immediately before her scream. The revelation of the captain's earlier confrontation with the Viscount near the ballroom's French doors provided investigators with their most promising lead. Several guests had witnessed the exchange, though none could swear to the exact words spoken. The captain's military background, which would have given him both the skill and strength necessary to deliver the fatal blow, made him an obvious suspect despite his apparent character and his obvious devotion to Lady Rosalind. Charles Whitmore's agitated behavior throughout the evening had been observed by numerous guests, and his obvious hatred of the Viscount was hardly a secret. His presence in the garden was confirmed by a gardener who had seen him pacing the paths in an obviously distressed state, and his intimate knowledge of the house from previous visits would have given him access to Lord Ashworth's study, where the murder weapon had been kept. But it was Mrs. Victoria Ashworth who possessed perhaps the most complex relationship with the deceased. Her history with the Viscount was known to a select few, and her position as the host's sister would have given her unquestioned access to every part of the house and grounds. Her calm efficiency in managing the crisis aftermath struck some observers as suspiciously controlled, as if she had been prepared for exactly this sort of emergency. The investigation revealed layers of motive that went far deeper than simple personal animosity. The Viscount's gambling debts had reached dangerous proportions, and his creditors included some of London's most ruthless moneylenders. His business dealings had involved questionable investments that had cost several prominent families substantial fortunes. His romantic entanglements had created a web of jealous husbands, discarded mistresses, and rival suitors that stretched across half the peerage. Most damaging of all was the discovery of a collection of letters in the Viscount's chambers, correspondence that revealed his systematic blackmail of several prominent figures. The letters detailed affairs, financial improprieties, and political indiscretions that would have destroyed reputations and ended careers if made public. Among the victims were a duke's son caught in flagrante with his commanding officer's wife, a cabinet minister who had profited illegally from government contracts, and a bishop whose theological studies had taken some decidedly unorthodox turns. As dawn approached and the investigation continued, the true scope of the Viscount's activities became clear. He had not simply been a rakish aristocrat with expensive tastes and flexible morals. He had been a predator who fed on others' weaknesses and secrets. His death had removed a threat to dozens of prominent individuals, any one of whom might have felt justified in taking extreme measures to protect themselves and their families. The locked study where the murder weapon had been kept presented its own puzzle. Lord Ashworth insisted that only family members possessed keys, yet the door had been found unlocked after the murder, and the letter opener was clearly missing from its usual place on the mahogany desk. Either someone had obtained a key through illicit means, or the killer was closer to the family than anyone wanted to admit. The garden itself became a map of suspicion, with investigators tracing the movements of each suspect through the maze of paths and hedges. Footprints in the soft earth around the rose beds told conflicting stories, while broken twigs and disturbed flower beds suggested a struggle that had not been immediately apparent. The killer had been methodical in cleaning up evidence, but small signs remained for those who knew how to read them. The morning sun rose over Thornwick Manor like a judge pronouncing sentence, its harsh light revealing details that moonlight had mercifully concealed. The rose garden, which had been a romantic sanctuary only hours before, now bore the grim testimony of violence. Trampled flower beds marked where investigators had searched for clues, while the fountain's gentle splashing seemed to mock the silence of death that lay heavy over the grounds. In the library, Magistrate Sir Reginald Thornbury conducted his investigation with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years untangling the legal complexities of county affairs. A lean, sharp-eyed gentleman with silver hair and the bearing of old authority, he had known most of the suspects since childhood and understood the labyrinthine relationships that bound county society together. His task was made infinitely more complex by the need to balance justice with discretion, for the wrong accusation could destroy not just an individual, but entire family lines stretching back centuries. The first revelation came from an unexpected source, young Timothy, an under-gardener whose nocturnal duties included checking the greenhouse heating systems. His testimony, delivered in the trembling voice of a servant terrified of contradicting his betters, placed Mrs. Victoria Ashworth in the garden a full hour before the murder was discovered. He had seen her dark figure moving among the hedges like a wraith, and while he had not dared to question a member of the family, her presence troubled him enough that he remembered it clearly. Mrs. Victoria faced this accusation with the cool composure that had carried her through 3 decades of society intrigue. Yes, she admitted she had been in the garden early in the evening, but purely by coincidence. The ballroom had grown insufferably warm, and she had sought the cooler air outside. Her route had taken her through the rose garden and around the fountain before returning to the house through the conservatory. She had seen no one during her walk and had certainly not encountered the Viscount alive or dead. But her composed explanation cracked slightly when confronted with the letter opener's history. The weapon, she was forced to acknowledge, had been a wedding gift from her late husband to her brother Lord Ashworth. She had often seen it on the study desk during her frequent visits to discuss household matters and estate business. As Lord Ashworth's sister and closest advisor, she possessed a key to virtually every room in the house, including the study where the weapon had been kept. Captain Harrington's examination proved equally revealing, though in different ways. His military bearing served him well under questioning, but certain inconsistencies in his timeline began to emerge. His claim to have been walking the garden's perimeter for contemplation did not align with the undergardener's observations, and his knowledge of the house's layout seemed more extensive than a first-time guest should possess. Most damaging was the revelation that he had served in the same Indian regiment as the Viscount 5 years earlier, a connection he had failed to mention during initial questioning. The truth, when it emerged, was more sordid than anyone had imagined. The Viscount and Captain had indeed served together, but their relationship had ended in scandal when the Viscount's cowardice during a native uprising had cost the lives of 12 British soldiers. Captain Harrington had filed a formal complaint, but the Viscount's family connections had ensured the matter was quietly buried. The captain's military career had suffered while the Viscount had been allowed to resign his commission with honor intact. This revelation transformed Captain Harrington from romantic hero to potential murderer in the space of a few sentences. His motive for revenge was now clear, and his military training had certainly provided him with the skills necessary to kill efficiently and silently. His obvious attraction to Lady Rosalind might have provided additional motivation, especially if he had witnessed the Viscount's insulting proposition during their dance. Charles Whitmore's interrogation revealed perhaps the most complex web of motives and opportunities. His presence in the garden was now explained by more than simple agitation over social slights. He finally admitted, followed the Viscount outside with the specific intention of demanding satisfaction for the evening's humiliations. His nouveau riche background had not prepared him for the subtle cruelties of aristocratic society, and the Viscount's cutting remarks about inherited versus earned status had struck at his deepest insecurities. The confrontation, when it came, had been everything Charles had feared and more. The Viscount had not merely refused his demand for an apology, but had threatened to expose certain irregularities in Charles's father's wartime manufacturing contracts. The implications were staggering. Not just social ruin, but potential criminal prosecution and the loss of everything the family had worked to achieve. Charles had left the encounter shaking with rage and fear, fully aware that his entire world hung in the balance. But perhaps the most shocking revelation concerned Lady Rosalind herself. The investigation uncovered a series of clandestine meetings between her and various political radicals, individuals whose ideas about social reform would have been considered treasonous by many in her circle. Her correspondence revealed a young woman torn between the privileges of her birth and a growing conviction that the aristocratic system was fundamentally unjust. The Viscount, it emerged, had somehow learned of these activities and had been using them to pressure Lady Rosalind into accepting his advances. His whispered proposition during their dance had not been merely crude, but calculated. Submit to his desires or face exposure as a political radical whose ideas could destroy her family's standing and possibly result in criminal charges. Each suspect now stood revealed as having powerful motives for murder, and each had possessed the opportunity to commit the crime. The investigation had uncovered a web of secrets and resentments that painted the Viscount not as a victim, but as a predator whose death had removed a threat to multiple innocent lives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter, a detailed examination of the murder weapon itself. Dr. Hammond's careful study revealed microscopic traces of a particular type of soil found only in one section of the garden, an area devoted to exotic orchids that required special growing medium imported from the Orient. This soil was found embedded in the letter opener's handle, suggesting the weapon had been hidden in the orchid house before or after the murder. The orchid house was Mrs. Victoria's particular domain, a greenhouse where she cultivated rare specimens that had become her passion since her husband's death. Only she possessed the key to this specialized facility, and only she would have known about the hiding places among the elaborate plant displays. The implication was clear: either she was the murderer or she had discovered the weapon after the crime and moved it to protect someone else. Under intense questioning, Mrs. Victoria's composure finally cracked. The truth, when it emerged, was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. She had indeed discovered the murder weapon, but not where investigators expected. The letter opener had been found in Lady Rosalind's reticule, placed there by person or persons unknown in what could only have been an attempt to frame the young woman for the Viscount's death. Mrs. Victoria's decision to remove and hide the weapon had been motivated not by guilt, but by protective instinct. She had recognized the setup for what it was and had acted to shield Lady Rosalind from accusations that could have destroyed her life regardless of her actual innocence. The hiding place in the orchid house had been chosen precisely because it was her exclusive domain, ensuring that suspicion would fall on her rather than on the vulnerable young woman she sought to protect. This revelation transformed the entire investigation, for it meant that the real killer was not only ruthless enough to commit murder, but calculating enough to attempt framing an innocent person for the crime. The question now became not just who had killed the Viscount, but who among the suspects possessed both the coldness to commit murder and the cunning to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the library where Magistrate Thornberry had assembled all the principal figures for his final revelations. The room's leather-bound volumes and oil portraits seemed to watch in silent judgment as the truth finally prepared to emerge from the web of lies and deceptions that had shrouded the Viscount's murder. Each suspect sat in careful isolation, their earlier social bonds now strained beyond recognition by the weight of mutual suspicion and shared secrets. Lady Rosalind occupied a chair near the tall windows, her composure maintained through sheer force, despite the knowledge that she had come within hours of being charged with murder. The revelation of Mrs. Victoria's protective actions had saved her from a gallows, but the experience had aged her beyond her 24 years. Captain Harrington stood protectively nearby, his military bearing intact, but his eyes reflecting the terrible understanding that honor and justice were not always aligned. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth faced her accusers with the dignity of a woman who had acted according to her conscience, regardless of personal cost. Her admission of evidence tampering had potentially saved an innocent life, but it had also compromised the investigation and cast doubt on her own innocence. She sat straight-backed and unflinching, prepared to accept whatever judgment was pronounced upon her actions. Charles Whitmore appeared to have aged a decade in the space of a single night. The The revelation of his father's potentially criminal wartime activities had added layers of desperation to his already precarious position. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the arms of his chair, and his eyes darted constantly between the other suspects as if seeking some sign of ally or enemy in the group that might determine his fate. But it was Lord Ashworth himself who commanded the room's attention as Magistrate Thornberry began his final summation. The Earl had maintained his composure throughout the investigation, providing information and access as required while preserving the dignity befitting his station. Yet careful observers had noted subtle changes in his demeanor, a tightness around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that suggested a man carrying an enormous burden. Magistrate Thornberry's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he began to reconstruct the events of the previous evening. The investigation, he announced, had revealed not a simple crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated execution designed to eliminate a threat while creating maximum confusion about the perpetrator's identity. The killer had not merely wanted the Viscount dead, but had sought to ensure that suspicion would fall on others who had equally compelling motives for murder. The first piece of evidence was the letter opener itself. Despite Mrs. Victoria's well-intentioned interference, forensic examination had revealed crucial details about its use. The angle and depth of the wound indicated that the killer had possessed significant physical strength and had struck with practiced precision. This eliminated Lady Rosalind from consideration not merely because of her frame, but because of the technical skill required to deliver such a blow. The second revelation concerned the timing of events. The undergardener's testimony, combined with careful analysis of other witness statements, established a timeline that placed each suspect in specific locations at crucial moments. Most significantly, it revealed that someone had been in Lord Ashworth's study approximately 30 minutes before the murder, suggesting premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. The third and most damaging piece of evidence was discovered in the Viscount's personal effects, a letter dated that very morning, addressed to Lord Ashworth, and containing allegations that would have destroyed the Earl's reputation and possibly resulted in criminal charges. The letter detailed evidence of systematic fraud in the management of estate finances, suggesting that Lord Ashworth had been embezzling funds from his tenants and falsifying records to cover his thefts. The magistrate's words fell into the library's silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread to encompass every person present. Lord Ashworth, the pillar of county society and model of aristocratic honor, stood accused of crimes that would have made him a pariah among his own class and potentially subject to transportation or worse if proven in court. But the Viscount's letter contained an even more devastating revelation. The evidence for these accusations had been gathered not through legitimate investigation, but through systematic burglary of the Earl's private papers. The Viscount had been breaking into his host's study for months, photographing documents and correspondence, building a case for blackmail that would have given him permanent power over one of the county's most influential families. Lord Ashworth's response to these accusations was characteristic of his military background: direct, unflinching, and utterly without self-pity. Yes, he admitted, he had been systematically diverting estate funds, but not for personal enrichment. The money had been used to support tenants who could not meet their rents due to poor harvests and economic difficulties following the war. His falsified records had hidden acts of charity that his steward and his wife would never have approved, presenting financial losses as administrative expenses rather than admitting to what they would have considered inappropriate sentiment. The irony was profound. The Viscount had been blackmailing a man for crimes that were actually acts of compassion. Lord Ashworth's thefts had been motivated not by greed, but by a paternalistic sense of duty to his people that went beyond the strict requirements of aristocratic responsibility. He had robbed himself to feed his tenants, compromising his own honor to preserve their dignity. But noble motives did not change the legal reality of his situation. The The Viscount's threat to expose these activities would have destroyed Lord Ashworth regardless of their charitable purpose, for the law recognized no distinction between theft for personal gain and theft for benevolent reasons. Faced with exposure that would have cost him everything, his title, his estate, his position in society, and his freedom, Lord Ashworth had chosen the only solution that seemed viable. The murder itself had been planned with military precision. Lord Ashworth had used his position as host to monitor the Viscount's movements, waiting for the moment when the man would be isolated and vulnerable. The choice of his own letter opener as the weapon was calculated to suggest that any of his guests might have taken it from his study, spreading suspicion among multiple suspects rather than pointing directly at him. The decision to place the weapon in Lady Rosalind's reticule had been the plan's cruelest element, designed to eliminate someone who could testify to the Viscount's blackmail attempts while creating a perfect scapegoat whose youth and gender would make her confession seem plausible. Only Mrs. Victoria's protective instincts had prevented this calculated betrayal from succeeding. As Lord Ashworth's confession filled the library with its terrible honesty, the true cost of the Viscount's predatory behavior became clear. A good man had been driven to murder and attempted frame-up. A devoted sister had been forced to compromise evidence to protect an innocent, and multiple lives have been forever altered by one man's willingness to destroy others for personal gain. Yet, even in confession, Lord Ashworth maintained his dignity. He had acted, he declared, not just to protect himself, but to preserve the estate for future generations and to ensure that his tenants would continue to receive the support they needed. The Viscount's blackmail would have exposed not just his illegal activities, but also the desperate circumstances that had made those activities necessary. The legal resolution was swift and decisive. Lord Ashworth was formally charged with murder in the first degree, but Magistrate Thornberry's recommendation for clemency, combined with testimony about his charitable motives and the Viscount's predatory behavior, resulted in a sentence that recognized the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Transportation was commuted to exile, allowing him to retain his life while losing everything else that had defined his existence. Lady Margaret Ashworth's reaction to her husband's confession was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire affair. Her cold fury at his deception was tempered by grudging admiration for his motives, creating a complex emotional landscape that would take years to navigate. The estate would pass to their eldest son, but the family name would carry the stain of scandal for generations. Mrs. Victoria's evidence tampering was officially overlooked in recognition of her protective intentions, but her position in society was forever altered by her association with the scandal. Captain Harrington and Lady Rosalind found their relationship purified by shared trauma, leading to an engagement that was announced within a month. Charles Whitmore quietly withdrew from society, using his father's money to purchase property in the Americas where nouveau riche backgrounds were less problematic. The garden at Thornwick Manor was eventually restored to its former beauty, but the rose bed where the Viscount had died was removed and replaced with a reflecting pool that seemed more appropriate for contemplating the complexities of human nature. The Fountain of Diana continued to splash in the moonlight, but subsequent visitors often remarked that the water seemed to whisper of secrets better left buried. In the end, the question of who killed the Viscount in the garden had been answered, but the deeper questions about justice, honor, and the price of maintaining civilized society remained as complex as ever. The aristocratic world that had created both the victim and his killer continued to function according to its elaborate rules. But the murder at Thornwick Manor had revealed the fault lines that ran beneath its polished surface. Years later, when the immediate scandal had faded into cautionary tale, those who remembered that night would reflect on how thin the line truly was between civilization and savagery, between honor and crime, between love and hate. In the rose garden where blood had once stained the earth, new flowers bloomed each spring, but they carried in their perfume the memory of how quickly paradise could transform into something far more dangerous. The story of Viscount Morningdale's murder became a legend whispered in drawing rooms and recounted in club smoking rooms, a reminder that even in the most refined circles, passion and desperation could drive decent people to terrible acts. And in the end, perhaps that was the most terrifying truth of all. Not that monsters walked among the aristocracy, but that ordinary people, faced with impossible choices, could become monsters themselves.